Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Wednesday's Global Talk at the Center for Global Studies. My name is Martin Bunton. I'm serving as the interim director, while the director, Oliver Schmidtka, is on a research leave this year in Berlin. It's been a wonderful year, a real pleasure to be able to host these talks. Before introducing our speaker today, Frank Hesser, let me start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. A couple of housekeeping items, of which I'm sure you're already fully familiar. We ask that you keep your microphone muted and your video off during the duration of the talk, but come the discussion period, the Q&A, if you could perhaps, if you feel comfortable, turn your video on, and we'll do what we can to foster a sense of hybrid community here. Do keep your microphones off, however, unless you want to make a comment or if you have a question. You can also feel free to use the chat function in Zoom if you have an observation or question during the talk, or a link to a helpful resource or something of that sort. And of course, we will monitor the chat so that we know of those questions. As you know, the presentation is being recorded, so thanks for that. Okay, our speaker today, Frank Hesser, who only just arrived. So first off, thank you for that. Thank you for allowing us to put you to work so quickly. Frank is visiting us from the University of Zurich, where he is a professor of international and comparative media. He has degrees in mass communications, master's and PhD degrees. His recent publications focus on mediatization of politics, the relationship between political populism and the media, and the spread and effects of misinformation and resilience against it. We have had a very full year of trying to follow all sorts of important events this year. But clearly, populism, misinformation, this is such an important one, if it's been somewhat marginalized over the last couple of months. So Frank, thank you so much for contributing to the center and for sharing your thoughts on this important subject. Frank.
Thank you very much, Martin. Welcome everybody who joins us remotely. Thank you for the nice introduction. It's an exciting opportunity for me to introduce myself and some of my work with you. Oh, thanks very much. The topic of my talk is resilience to online disinformation, a framework for comparing 18 countries. Before I delve into it, I would like to share with you a few items of background in terms of my disciplinary background. I see myself at the intersection of international and comparative politics on the one hand, and media and communication studies on the other. In particular, my main area of interest and specialism probably is political communication. There is an academic journal out there with the title Political Communication, and I'm one of the associate editors of it. And there's also an important division of the International Communication Association specializing in political communication, and I'm the chair of that division. So political communication is my disciplinary home. I'm here now from mid-April to early July, and I will be working on a project that is tentatively titled Social Media and Democracy: How to Improve Digital Resilience of Societies and Citizens in order to combat political extremism and disinformation. The most obvious links are to the European Studies Program, the Europe-Canada Network, oh, now I see a typo on the slides. There was one more program group where I thought the connections are most obvious, but I hope that through getting to know more people and being exposed to this exciting environment here, I will also get input from other perspectives. My talk today is a pilot study towards this larger project, and in the interest of time, I would like to go right to it. It is a cross-national comparative study, and you see here marked in red the 18 countries in North America and in particular in Europe that are included in this study. Our starting point is a concern in a growing number of countries about people being not necessarily uninformed, but disinformed, holding inaccurate factual beliefs and use incorrect information to form opinions and attitudes. We started this pilot project, which I'm presenting today, a couple of years back, and at the time, the debate around disinformation was already heavily politicized. So the term fake news, for example, was mainly used to discredit, to delegitimize news organizations, for example, if we think of how Donald Trump uses the term. And we felt that the clarity was needed and an analytical perspective was needed in this debate. Secondly, most of the research was very country specific when we started this. So it surrounded the debate in the UK around the controversial Brexit referendum and the 2016 presidential election in the United States when Trump became president. And we weren't quite sure whether these two heavily debated cases were representative or outliers. So we felt that comparison was needed. And there was uncertainty about the scope of the problem. How many people do in fact encounter disinformation? How many perceive it to be a problem? So we felt that as a third item on our to-do list, a theoretical framework would be necessary to facilitate the discussion, and international measures would be needed to explain the cross-national varieties that I will report in a couple of minutes. So I want to talk to all these 3 points that I itemize here as research problem, and would like to start with the first, namely that clarity is needed in terminology. We start our discussion here by distinguishing 3 terms, namely misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. One could already write a book on the terminology and their meanings and interpretations and where the boundaries are and what the cross-national variation here is, but I will keep it very simple and will just say that in terms of misinformation, we define it here as the unintentional publication of information that turns out to be false, that turns out to be misleading. I will focus on the second group here, namely disinformation. False information that is shared with a strategic purpose of creating harm. So the deliberate use of false information to achieve political and sometimes commercial goals. And then there's a third area, malinformation, where genuine information is shared to cause harm, for example, by making private information publicly available, leaks and other purposes, but let me be very clear that I will focus on the second term, namely disinformation. Yes, there are the boundaries are mainly analytical, and in practice there is a lot of blurring, but it is still a helpful starting point. But disinformation is surely the most worrisome aspect of the debate. So this is what I would like to talk about more. So the question is, how can we explain the diffusion of disinformation and the consumption of disinformation? And I believe that two groups of factors can be distinguished here: individual factors and technological and strategic factors. Let's look at the individual factors first. They mainly come from the area of social psychology, namely people's confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and naive realism. This has confirmation bias refers to a tendency of people to believe information that confirms their own worldviews. And motivated reasoning refers to the fact that people tend to justify their beliefs and opinions and attitudes with information they wish to be true. But that may not necessarily what the evidence shows or scientific evidence shows. Naive realism refers to a belief that people often believe that their own perception of reality is in fact the only accurate perception of reality. But again, this also often is not necessarily true. A second area is people's inability to recognize the quality of information and the nature of this information. This refers to let me say, a polluted online information environment where people tend to become confused about what is true and what is not true. There's so much information distributed on social media, for example, that makes it harder and harder for people, in particular if they are perhaps less experienced, less media literate with regards to recognizing what's true and what's false. And then we have the second area of technological and strategic factors. Given that social media plays such a huge role, there are many groups out there. This includes governments, this includes parties, but also advocacy groups, activists who use this information environment to spread propaganda, to spread information with a specific spin, with a specific frame that is beneficial to their own cause. And increasingly, they also use computational techniques here, bots and astrosurfing, and again, one could have a big discussion about it. But here it should suffice to say that based on these, on this background, we need more knowledge on the opportunity structures that are present in certain contexts, media systems, societies, that either foster or can limit the diffusion and consumption of disinformation. So we will focus on disinformation. We assume that disinformation circulates not at the same speed in each society, is not consumed to the same extent in each society. We expect there to be cross-national differences and we want to know more about why we find them and what the drivers, but also the filters and potential obstacles are. So this brings us already to the observation that not all countries are equally affected by the distribution, the dissemination of disinformation. What we see here are results from the Reuters Digital News Report. This is a survey conducted in many countries each year. And one of their questions is, in the last week, have you personally come across stories that are completely made up for political or commercial reasons? So what we see here from a comparative perspective are people's perceived exposure to disinformation, the proportion of people who say they were exposed to completely made up news in the last week. I marked 4 countries. Switzerland, the country where I am from, Canada, the country where I am now based, the United States, our big neighbor next door, and Turkey. So if we take the group of which Switzerland is a member, so apparently a group where only a small proportion of people report being exposed to disinformation, we see Western European welfare democracies, democratic corporatist systems where only 9 to 14% of people see this as a problem. At the other end of the spectrum, of which Turkey is a prototypical case, we see Southern European countries, but also Malaysia as an Asian country, Mexico as a Latin American country, where 40 to 50% of people say, I see it almost every day in my social media feed. And then we have a big middle group, of which Canada and the United States are 2 members. What we take away here is this cross-national variance. So the problem is not equally pronounced in each country. There are differences. And I'm interested in why we see these differences. Well, and now we have 2 types of scholars. One group of scholars focuses on the countries where the problem is particularly severe. Point taken, I'm not a member of that group. I'm a member of the other camp. I focus on the countries that seem to be more resilient against the distribution and consumption of disinformation. And I ask myself, what is so peculiar about those countries where the problem is less severe? Can we perhaps learn something about those countries and then implement this, whatever we can learn from those countries, in other countries to get a better grip of the problem and reduce the problem? So I'm using the term resilience. It is not a term that has been used a lot in the field of political communication, but I believe it has potential. The downside is not much has been published, and so I have to stay a little vague here, but I believe that this term will have quite a career in front of, ahead of it. So resilience is usually defined in sociology as the capacity of groups bound together in a community to sustain their well-being in the face of challenges. So resilience is bound to challenges. What kind of challenges? The literature on resilience says that these challenges are usually structural challenges. And I should also emphasize that I'm not interested in individual resilience. So there's a lot of discussion about increase your own individual resilience, make improve your coping strategies with stress and so on. No, I'm not interested in individual resilience. I'm interested in social resilience. And this has to do apparently with structural context. And if I look now at what potential challenges there are to social resilience with regards to disinformation, I can come up with problems like political polarization in a country, media fragmentation, I would say more about these terms, distrust in institutions that operate on reason and evidence, like science, like law, like professionalism, disregard for a public health approach towards media regulation. So these are structural elements that can perhaps improve resilience if they are present in a society, whereas they can also be an entry point for disinformation if they are present in a way that fosters the diffusion of disinformation. So a key insight here is that resilience towards disinformation has to do with the structural context in society. And I'm interested in a context where disinformation does not reach a large number of citizens. I'm interested in a context where people are less inclined to further distribute it. Yeah? And want to identify structural factors that help achieve this goal. So in terms of the goals that I try to achieve with this pilot study is I would like to contribute to theory building. I would like to develop a theoretical framework that identifies country conditions which promote or impede the spread of disinformation. But I don't want to stop there. Building a theory, building a framework is fine, but I would also like to operationalize this theoretical framework and get measures, tools that allow me to rank countries. I would like to measure something within countries so that I can place Canada, for example, in relation to other countries. Yeah. So my third goal is an empirical analysis. I would like to examine a large group of countries, and I will focus on Western countries because the availability of data is better than in other groups of countries, and I have to start somewhere. So I will focus on Western countries to create a baseline and then invite other groups of scholars to start from there and expand. And I would like to create a typology. I would like to group countries, see familiarities in groups of countries, and then characterize more vulnerable countries and put them in one group, whereas more resilient countries that I can put in another group. And then create a typology and introduce this to the scientific community and say, well, I brought some order to these 18 countries by placing countries that have similarities with regard to my problem, spread of disinformation. Finally, my fourth goal is I would like to interpret this and show the heuristic value of my original theoretic framework and say, well, there is something empirical to it. I can show the validity and heuristic value. And these are now the 4 steps that I will take in the next 10 to 12 minutes. So let's start with theory building. Yeah. Let's start with developing a theoretical framework of country conditions. I try to be parsimonious, I try to be simple and say, okay, three areas I will focus on: the political environment of countries, the media environment, and the economic environment. And from each of these three spheres, I would like to identify specific components, specific factors. From the political environment, I would like to discuss high and low polarization and their effect on the dissemination of disinformation, and high and low spread of populist communication and their relationship to the spread of disinformation. Yeah. So, polarization of society. I would like to argue that if polarization is high in a society, I have a lot of partisans in that society that hold strong negative feelings about the opposing side. All these partisans will tend to believe only their own side and mainly share information that supports their own side and hurts the opposing side. I believe an environment with high polarization decreases resilience against disinformation or fosters the distribution of disinformation. Populist communication, I would like to argue that high populism is also a problem, because populism lives on the divide between we as a morally good group of people versus them who are corrupt evildoers. And those corrupt evildoers, in the view of populists, conspire against us. So conspiracy theories feature big in societies with a high level of populist communication. Populists tend to see experts and science and fact checkers as a group that can't be trusted. And this also includes journalists and professors. They're all left-wingers, have their own self-interest and conspire against us, the good people. And the good people, they don't need science. They don't need fact checkers. All they do is they listen to their stomach, we say in Swiss, to hunch feelings. And this is the compass that leads us to a fair society. So, high level of populist communication, again, decreases resilience and fosters the circulation of disinformation. Media environment. A media environment where people have low trust in news media, distrust news media, is a society, according to research, where people don't believe less in factual information. A society where people use alternative media because they don't trust the mainstream news media and social media, they find those alternative and social media outlets to provide them mainly with emotionalized, sensationalist content and more disinformation. And people who avoid the mainstream media because they don't trust it also show, according to research, less knowledge of public affairs. This again decreases resilience. Public service broadcasting also plays a role. Not because public service broadcasting is great as such, not necessarily, but research shows that public service broadcasting have an ecological effect on other news organizations. A media system with strong public service broadcasting condition the media markets towards higher standards of news. They teach other news organizations what are high news standards and drive other news organizations towards higher levels of performance, and this again facilitates higher levels of political knowledge in society. Finally, media fragmentation. A society with a high level of media fragmentation is a society where people use mainly media, fringe media, small media that confirm what they hope confirms also their own worldview. So it is a society where everybody sits in their own little filter bubbles, consuming mostly information coming from sources that presents them with selected menus of information that confirms their prior attitudes. Again, it is not a society that makes people particularly resilient towards disinformation. Finally, the economic environment. A large media market that is very commercialized because of the size of the advertising markets and the dependency on advertising has greater incentives for distributing information that maximizing views, maximizing clicks, maximizes revenue, and it is also an environment that pushes the boundaries of responsible and ethical journalism. It will provide more sensationalist, more emotionalist, more distorted news. Again, of course, I have to be very simple here and paint the picture in very brush strokes, but you get the idea. And so again, limits resilience. Finally, high social media use. So a society that depends on social media for political information is a society where people will experience a lot of disinformation, because social media is the place where people share information without verifying. They don't have the time, they scroll, if they like something, they share it, but this is not necessarily ideal for constraining or impeding disinformation. And the research shows that social media use limits political learning and knowledge of political affairs. So high dependency on social media for political news decreases resilience. That is a theoretical model where we identify factors that we believe are related to the spread of disinformation. Good, fine, it's a starting point. And now we could discuss it whether it makes sense or not, but as I said, we would like to go one step further and would like to translate these theoretical indicators that we find on the left of this slide into measurable indicators that we find in the middle column. So, for example, populist communication and whether or not it is widespread in a society. How can we measure this? Well, we could measure this with the vote share of populist parties and whether or not populist parties have gained in support and how populist leaders communicate. Yeah. Same is true for other theoretical indicators. We try to find measurable tools, and here we provide also the data sources that we use for finding empirical, quantifiable information. So we were looking for quantifiable data on these theoretical indicators. And we want to use this to explain our outcome, namely exposure to online disinformation, what we see in the bottom row here. This is what we would like to explain. We would like to explain this earlier chart that showed us the cross-national variance in reported exposure to disinformation with these bar charts. So we went ahead and used these measurable indicators to rank countries. This has nothing to do with disinformation yet. This has only to do with our measurable indicators. And we see here a list of countries. It starts with Finland at the left end of the spectrum and ends with the United States at the right end, from my view at least, of the spectrum. We see that the bar chart for the United States goes down. Down means we enter vulnerable territory. And these are the two labels that I used at the right end of the figure here, vulnerability and resilience. So the bar chart for Finland goes up, and I argue that Finland is a resilient country with regard to the measures that I've introduced earlier. Why do we consider Finland a resilient country? Because of the indicators I introduced earlier. In Finland, we see low polarization in society, this is blue. We see low populism in society, gray. We see high media trust. We see shared media use, so not a high level of media fragmentation, but people tend to use a small number of highly respected news organizations that have a reputation for providing high quality news. Finland has strong public service broadcasting, a low level of social media use for political information, and a small market size. We have the opposite picture in the United States, where the bar goes down into vulnerable territory. Why? Because according to our data, polarization is high, populist communication in 2018 was high, media trust was low, media fragmentation was high, public service broadcasting plays almost no role in the United States, social media is heavily used for political information, and the size of the advertising media market is also high. And now we can place all other countries in between, and our prediction would be that based on these structural environment, we would expect disinformation to be a huge problem in the United States and be only a very limited problem in Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands, and this group of countries. What we did next was that we tried to group these countries based on the results. How can you group countries? Well, one statistical measure of grouping countries is cluster analysis. And this is what we did. So we used a statistical procedure that allowed us to group countries according to these structural factors. And we find a big group that is marked in blue here, and that we label as media supportive. And Canada is a member of that group, together with Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, Sweden, and the UK. And I will argue that this is a resilient country against this spread of disinformation. Then we have two problematic groups. We have a polarized group with Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. And according to our data, according to the cluster analysis, we have the United States. And the United States is so peculiar that it forms its own group, its own cluster. This is an important reminder that the United States is actually a very special country, that you cannot necessarily throw in a group with many other countries because of its particular setting. What we have in the United States, marked in red here, is A couple of problems with regards to the spread of disinformation. A huge market size, a high degree of media fragmentation, low shared media, and the strength of public service broadcasting very, very low. But now I'm looking at the spider webs and the red spider web. Social media heavily used for political information, lower media trust in other countries, higher populism and higher polarization. Whereas Canada is a member of other democratic corporatist media systems with higher support for public service broadcasting, stronger regulations on media ownership, but also advertising, election coverage, higher levels of trust in media, lower audience fragmentation, more consensual, less polarized political culture. And now the question is, how does this now relate to the spread of disinformation? This has only to do with opportunity structures. And based on the contextual environment, I argue that the United States has not very resilient structural conditions for combating disinformation, whereas the blue group should be more resilient. So our final step was a regression analysis. I will not go into the details here, but what I try to explain now is this earlier chart. Let me go back. I tried to explain the variance or the distribution that we see in this chart here. This is my dependent variable, and actually only 18 of those countries, not all of them. So I tried to explain why Germany has a lower proportion of people who report to be exposed to disinformation, whereas then countries at the other end where people report a much higher likelihood to be exposed to disinformation. So this is my dependent variable, and my predictors, my causal variables, my independent variables are the measures that I introduced earlier. The amount of populism in a country, the amount of polarization, and so on. And what we find is the bottom row shows us the level of explained variance, and it is 83%. 0.83 is the R squared here. So my variables can explain 83% of this cross-national variance that we found in this earlier chart. So apparently it is high explanatory power. Not all of them lead to significant results in this regression, and this has a lot to do with limitations of data, but media trust, for example, seems to play a very, very high role. So low media trust means high likelihood that people in that country report to encounter disinformation. Social media, people who use social media a lot will also encounter a lot of disinformation. Huge market size means a lot of disinformation, but also many of the other variables, even if they're not statistically significant, point into the right direction. So my takeaway here is that, acknowledging all the limitations with statistical data that we usually have, but the factors that we have in our theoretical model can explain the amount of disinformation in a country. So apparently there's something to this theoretical model. Okay, last slide. Here in my conclusion, would like to emphasize again, there is large country variance in resilience or vulnerability to online disinformation. I could identify 3 country clusters, could place Canada in the neighborhood of other countries and explain why Canada could be placed there, and that the problem is most likely less severe here than it is in the United States, and that we can explain this difference with systematic structural factors. Yes, there are many limitations. We would need to have more countries, we would need to have better indicators, and need to measure disinformation better than we did here. Let me remind you, our measure of disinformation is what people report, what people perceive as disinformation, and then say in a survey, I experienced disinformation. How reliable is this? Is something we can discuss. Because we had our own questions about it, we used a second indicator as our main dependent variable, namely expert ratings. So in each of these countries, we asked experts, how big of a problem is disinformation according to your knowledge? And the source here is the varieties of democracy indicator. This is a big study coming out of Scandinavia based on academics. And if we use this other dependent variable, so not asking media users, but scholars, academic experts, then we can still explain 40% of the variety. Not necessarily bad, but I'm happy to acknowledge many problems here, and that's also the reason why this was a pilot study, and we did follow-up studies, but in our follow-up studies we did not include Canada, so I thought I'd rather share with you this pilot study. I would like to end here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
The end of, I did not say the end of COVID, but the transitions out of various stages of COVID have brought applause back, I think, so thankfully. Thank you very much, Frank. We have a lot of information and much to discuss. Would anybody like to lead us off? Sorry, my apologies in advance for having my back to you. Still working this all out myself. I have a question, perhaps to start.
Yeah, sure.
Great, thanks. So I'm wondering about the extent to which maybe some of these relationships could be a little chicken and egg. So on the one hand, we have, for example, with the media, that weak public broadcasting is an indicator of less resilience, more disinformation. Okay? But to what extent can populism contribute to having a weak public broadcasting system? To what extent does disinformation itself, right, contribute to accusations against the elites, et cetera, which reduces funding, which weakens the public broadcasting system? But then again, the way I ask that question, it's not really chicken and egg. Maybe it's it's to be aware of a dynamic where these things develop a certain momentum. Maybe that's a better kind of relation. I'm thinking this through as I ask.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with you that there is an interdependence between various factors, and so our theoretical model was interested in describing an opportunity structure for the spread of disinformation. And we are not necessarily arguing that there is a direct causal relationship, but a specific constellation of variables, a specific constellation of favorable opportunity structures will make it more likely that we see a spread of disinformation. But I fully agree that a society with a high degree of populism populists will also fight public service broadcasting because they would consider it as public service broadcasting part of the elite, heavily intertwined with the state, mouthpiece of elites far removed from ordinary ordinary citizens. So yeah, there is an interrelationship between these various.
So it's more the nature.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
If I can just comment based on my experience with the journalism school.
Mhm.
So we talk a lot about ad revenue. So because public funding for these public service broadcasts have decreased over the years. So for example, if we look at CBC in Canada, it relies a lot more on money. But then if there's a distrust in these types of media, they get less clicks and less ad revenue, both on their articles, but also on TV and maybe on radio. So there is like a little bit of a circularity in that aspect, because less viewership definitely equals less resources and abilities.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
Can I ask also as a follow-up, money? Like, to what extent can individuals with vast amounts of money impact this process to, for example, contribute to fragmentation of the media by bankrolling their own sources that aren't necessarily reliant on ad revenues?
Yes, we included this as a media regulatory factor. So in some societies, we see stronger media regulation, for example, on ownership that tries to prevent exactly this, that individuals can accumulate media power by buying up news organizations and then use them as an instrument, as a channel to promote their own political ideologies, for example. And in some more welfare-oriented societies, cooperative societies, they have stronger media laws preventing this, whereas in more liberal, more liberal economies, less regulated economies, we have an attitude, let the market deal with this, and not the law, not politicians. And this, for this, the United States is a prototypical example. They say the less regulation, the better, and the market will solve everything. Well, I would argue that when it comes to the media, the market will pretty quickly turn into a dysfunctional market with regard to quality of information.
Fascinating. Natalie, please.
Hi. Thanks so much for such a timely talk. I think we're all thinking about these issues, and we have been for some years now, and it was really very interesting to see such a rigorous analysis, and knowing that you're going to be producing more material with a more detailed analysis in the future is really encouraging. But my question is really asking you to comment on something. I was really struck by how similar your summary chart of perceived exposure to disinformation looked to charts fairly routinely produced, I think, by the Pew Center that compare measures of liberal democracy in countries. And the sort of where the countries are located on your chart is very similar to where the same countries are located on the measures of liberal democracy study result that the Pew Center turns out every few years. And I think actually it's annually. So what I'm trying to get at is something that I think you discussed in several different ways, but maybe not explicitly. And that is that countries of the global South have higher perceived levels of exposure to disinformation on average. And those countries are often countries in which traditional measures of liberal democracy are weaker. And this recurring division between countries of the global North and countries of the global South that goes back to the 19th century family of nations, idea of the compact, the global compact, the four-nation compact that led to the family of nations. And this this degree of resilience of political and social institutions that we've traditionally associated with those countries, it seems like there's a lot of alignment here. And I don't quite know how to ask you the question that I want to ask, but is this just a measure of the resilience of the political culture of these countries? Or is it closely aligned with that? I guess that's what I want to ask.
It's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a very succinct answer for it. I would need to think about it more. But I believe that trusted institutions does play a big role here, that there are some more corporatist liberal democracies where people tend to trust those institutions more because they have experienced them as being reliable. And in other societies where these institutions seem to be more corrupted and captured by powerful groups who abuse them for their own goals. But we, in our empirical analysis, focus on 18 Western democracies. And usually we don't see big differences with regard to measures of democracy within this group of Western democracies. They're fairly similar, and the variance is not so big. The chart that I used at the beginning does include more than the 18 countries we were able to include in our analysis. And it's true that the most vulnerable countries like Turkey and Malaysia and some Latin American countries and Eastern European countries, we were not able to include here for lack of data. Yeah, I can only take your question as an input also for myself to think about this connection between the quality of information and the quality of democracy. I have to agree with you, there is a link, and to sort this out, conceptually, I would need to think about it a little more, and then perhaps we can catch up in a couple of weeks over a cup of coffee and discuss this further once I had a chance to think about it a little more.
Thank you, Natalie.
I could take a shot. Yeah. Thank you, Franco. Really good presentation on that. Certainly a topic that's bothering me. Virtually everyone else I know. So thank you for your work, and it's good. It's wonderful to see this kind of disciplined deep dive into trying to figure out what in fact is going on. I think many of us have a strong intuitive sense that things are right, and so on. There is an interesting piece that's been circulating in the last few weeks that I just want to draw attention to. It's Bruce Anderson's Abacus opinion polling has put out they took Pierre Poilievre, who's the populist, leader of the race to become the new conservative leader in Canada and then the next prime minister, possibly. They actually took a clip of him, put him together, what I would call disinformation. I went back to that, and they showed it to 2,000 people across the country, and it was remarkable how much it resonated across all political parties. Where you get like certainly 83% of the conservatives or something would say they liked it, or the People's Party. But the liberals and socialist Democrat parties also large portions with this, and it was the way that he linked these things together. But it was very interesting because I was sort of listening to yours, and I say, first of all, I do recommend taking a look at that. I just put in Abacus and Pierre Poilievre, and you will find that, and it's worth watching that in a clip for one thing, because it'll frighten the hell out of you. And then when you see the results of it, it'll be even more of a pony. You'll get even more frightened, because this stuff is really, really good. This guy's Good. This is what he says. Because the government has taken, as they've taken away your freedom by big government interfering in your more and more in your life, what they've done is they've made things so unaffordable that the guy who built your home can't afford to live in it. Nor can young people, nor can new immigrants round up those groups. And it just makes these great, so I mean, this is an interesting question around disinformation. I don't know whether it's disinformation. The real concern and fear here and the issue is, it's a very real issue of affordability, but they just start making these linkages.
Yeah.
Linking this with this, and before long you've got this, and he says it in a very clear, compelling way, and before long you actually want to believe this, right? Because it's so simple. And one of the things he concludes is, therefore, defund the CDC.
Yeah.
Right? Defund the CDC. We will defund the CDC because that's just another state intervention. And get rid of any kind of consensus on truth or whatever the CDC public accountability is, right? So let's get more of this fragmentation of freedom. Like the whole narrative is around promoting exactly all the factors that you say in your study contribute to the problem. I'm just trying to question here so much as is that why your discipline work here resonates with very much with that, but it doesn't. But I guess if I did have a question, it's around, well, what it really is when is disinformation not disinformation? And a lot of it just appears to be false associations or inappropriate associations.
Or a strategic goal behind it. So the deliberate purpose behind constructing this kind of message, and this, I'm sure, has been market researched in many environments, and until they found a success formula where they think this resonates, at least with a target group that is large enough to bring us over the threshold for the next election. So there will be many people who will dismiss this, granted, but we need to create a group, we need to create a community that will help us bring us over the threshold, and that will win us the next election. And this will be pieced together, and all these elements play a role here. And if it is done with a strategic purpose, then it is disinformation. If this purpose is missing, then it is misinformation. There's oftentimes that only later it turns out, oh, this was wrong. But at the time I didn't know. We as academics call it then misinformation. It's not true. We need a term for it. But if it comes with a strategic goal, we will term it disinformation.
He sounds just about the same as what Annie does now, really.
Yeah.
And she's now termed not dissing immigrants, she's talking about affordability and trying to round everybody out. Right? And so I mean, it's not, we aren't making this stuff up here.
No, we don't.
But our guy's this guy's pretty good.
But we should also say there is also populist communication on the left.
Oh, really?
That is what we find in Latin America and
Oh, I'm sure, yes.
left-wing parties in Europe, and in that case, you would argue against the big banks and against globalization. And so, unfortunately, it works for both sides.
No, absolutely.
Rod, do you have your video on? Rod Dobell?
I do have the video on. I wanted to thank our speaker for a really excellent presentation, very persuasive. I've got many, many ideas churning around in my head. Did want to comment that, just following up on Natalie's comment, of course, the spectrum that you started with is also very much like the spectrum with the Human Development Index or any of the happiness index, and to some extent it is a kind of a common grouping. And you're trying to explain with one factor or one set of factors, a grouping that shows up in lots of different ways. I was interested, though, you started with the suggestion that your term resilience was a term with a big future in in social sciences. And I was musing about, of course, it already had its big future in ecology and study of ecological systems. And one of the problems, right from Buzz Holling's first sort of introduction of the idea, was what really do you want to mean by this idea of a system which is robust against shocks? You don't really want to mean that the system can restore itself to its original kind of structure, because that means you don't change, you don't progress. So you have to have some thought as to what is the system structure to which you're wishing the system had the capacity to return in the face of challenges. And you commented that you weren't thinking so much about shocks as you were about underlying structural challenges. And I think that makes sense, but it puts you into the awkward position that you really have to decide what is the nature of the social well-being that you're trying to preserve in the face of these challenges. And of course, I think to some extent that gets you back into the discussion of democracies and so on. But it also gets you into this question of that we're facing a lot with the artificial intelligence world. What do we mean by human well-being? What are the goals to which we would like our AI agents to be taking us? What are the features of the system? So I guess I'm suggesting it becomes a real challenge in the choice of dependent variable to some extent. I guess it is, or in the capacity that you're trying to build in. So that was one comment. The other was just to observe that in this world of deep fakes, and when GPT-3 can write us a news story which is completely indistinguishable from the New York Times columnists, we're having a real challenge knowing not just what is truth, but how would we recognize it when we see it. So I guess I wish you great luck in pursuing this research project, because I think it really is aiming at a pretty fundamental question in our current age.
Thank you very much. I liked a lot what you said about the dangers of using resilience in a unreflected way, because yes, I agree with you. Resilience has a conservative bias to it, because you try to celebrate the status quo, and any kind of change seems as a threat, and you would like to prevent the system from changing. This is a danger that I am aware of, and perhaps it has also prevented scholars from touching the concept. It is under theorized, or it is used for different reasons in different areas. So it needs a much stronger theoretical grounding to be more precise about what we mean by it. I understand it more in terms of an ecology. Actually, a term that you also used, that ecologies are under constant change out there. That's the whole idea of ecologies. And even in times of dramatic ecological change, these systems are able to sustain a stable and balanced mode of operation. So I can only speak metaphorically here because the theoretical language has not been developed for the social science for this term, but I fully agree with your reflections on it, and must also say that perhaps this shows us also the perhaps the opportunities also, because one can do something, one can create something new with the term, but work needs to be done. So I have to thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod. It occurs to me as I'm struggling with hybridity here, that normally Oliver, if we were all in the room, probably would have started today's talk with some introductions with a new fellow in our hallways. I didn't do that, but I do note in the chat that some fellows like Maria have had to leave the chat, but her work is closely related. Rod has already pointed out that Oliver Schmidtke, and it's really too bad Oliver wasn't here for this work, but do know that you're connected to Oliver through this connection to the center. And the Cedar Tree Initiative, based here, another important contributor to this field. Stephanie Grill with the Borders and Globalization Project has pointed out the work that they do in very similar terms. So Natalie, Rod, Stephanie, Maria, all of you, thank you for pointing these connections out to Frank. And please, in the days to come, weeks to come, please reach out to Frank. And Frank, as I'm sure you already feel free to reach out to everybody in the center. But is there anybody else here who would, and Ivan, thank you for, is there anybody else as part of the seminar who would, if just like to kind of reach out to Frank and point out the similarities of their research and the different discussions, conversations that can have, please feel free to do that right now as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I would like to support this message. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and we have an opportunity.
That's the reason why I'm here.
I know. So we're still struggling with hybridity, right, in the waves of COVID, but we'll do the best we can.
Frank, I'll certainly be tapping on your door to try to arrange a cup of coffee or at some point in the next few weeks. Our work does not overlap very much, but I had a previous life as a political scientist. So maybe we can find some common ground there.
Thank you, Natalie, as ever. And of course, we have the center has Jody, and Jody's always wonderful. Fazila, thank you.
Hello. I'm a bit shy today, sorry. But it was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed listening. I was making a lot of connections in my mind because I'm a little familiar with the Turkish context and Italian context. And so I was trying to connect all the different variables that came up in trying to find the elements of resilience in the presentation. And so it was very interesting listening to. And by the way, sorry, I just popped in like that, but I'm also collaborating in a project led by Oliver Schmidtke on populism and situation of democracy in 4 European countries. And I guess these are all topics that are strictly related among each other. So if I guess Dr. Essen told at the beginning the amount of time that he's going to stay at the center, but I might have missed that. How long are you gonna be at the center so that we can maybe connect anytime soon and maybe explore possibilities of exchanging opportunities of collaboration?
July 1st, sorry. July 1st.
July 1st. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver Brandis, do you want to, we have a couple of Olivers in positions of importance.
Yeah, every good center needs a bit of resilience in the form of a backup Oliver, and I play that role. But our work so I'm Oliver Brandis. I wear a variety of hats. One hat that's a little bit relevant to the conversation is and Ivan is very familiar with this work. We do a broader project sort of on water sustainability around governance. And fairly quickly in our work, we learned the importance of how you create stories and narratives, you know, and I think that's, if I take a subtext of what you're talking about, that you're talking about the use of stories and narratives in your case or in your research for mischievous reasons, versus what we're trying to do, which is trying to elevate a truth, right? Like, we believe communities have a truth about caring about their watersheds. Communities, we just don't often think about that in the policy context or in the legal context, and so that gets lost. So we try and elevate that narrative, a truthful narrative, I guess. And you're saying, and again, you know, the work, I feel for you, must be exhausting and depressing at times, but maybe optimistic if you can riddle it out. But there's a couple of colleagues, and Ivan certainly knows some of them. Angus McAllister, who does a lot of focus work, a lot about how you create these narratives and understanding the audience segmentation and understanding how different audience can or can't be influenced. There's an initiative that we work with called Code Blue. I have relatively little role in that, but it again is about sort of elevating these narratives. And Sherry, who's there with you across the table, might be able to connect you to some of the champions there. And I know that they'll be very interested in your presentation. So maybe when Kayla has this sort of online, we can make sure that they get that and Sherry can coordinate it. But there's one more person who I think you'll have some interest in. And Martin and Jody would know from our recent sustainability session, a new colleague at the university named Sean Holman, who's a journalist by training and has a chair, for lack of a better word, I'm not sure if it's actually a chair, but it's a sort of designated role, and in particular is interested in climate and both the misinformation around it, but also the ability to create a common narrative, right? And I think that from a deep professional sense, you'd have a lot of interest, and he'd have a lot of interest in your work. And so I'm happy to help make that connection as well. So there's a number of really interesting pieces here, because what we're talking about is the ability to communicate effectively with target audiences and hopefully elicit change. And the challenge is when you have a lot of misinformation, even when you try and do the credible work, which takes 10 times longer, gets lost in the wash. And so that's a theme that I kind of pick up on. And so how do you inoculate a society so that it gets better at the critical thinking skills so that it can distinguish the hard work that goes into really credible information versus the relatively easy work of random opinion that serves a very clear and obvious purpose that many of us seem to see, but not everybody says. But anyway, thank you for your work.
I have to thank you. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver, for making, and Fazwa for those connections.
Yeah, so maybe Sherry, you can help connect. And then once we get the recording, I'll spread the word. And Laura as well, Laura, who works with us, who's our communications director, will be very interested in some of this. You know, these are trends that we all have to watch, but we don't even know what we're looking for, right? And so we're desperate to understand how we riddle our way out of it, because we know it's happening. It's like a slow motion car wreck, but we can't seem to stop it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Frank, your attention to operationalize these ideas. That's very important to many here and to the heart of the center and its mission. So thank you for bringing that to the table too. Okay, I'll pause a little bit, but otherwise to sort of indicate that I'll wrap this up soon. So, okay, before I thank Frank, and I'll ask you to join me in that, let me first share some upcoming events. We've had a very busy couple of weeks. as we do our best to try to make sense of, in as informed a way as possible, the world around us. Next week, on Tuesday, April 26th, our Associate Fellow John Price, who chairs the Canada-China Focus, they are hosting a webinar entitled Worker and Union Solidarity with China, Why and How. And a lot of that is how we even have the terminology to talk about, right? To understand and criticize China in these days. On Thursday, April 28th at 10 a.m., we are co-hosting with the School of Public Admin a discussion on Ukraine. And we're entitling that Understanding Ukraine, Changing Sociology, Politics, and Nationhood. There will be a number of Ukraine events that we can talk about over the next few weeks. On the 2nd of May, we are also co-hosting with the Canadian International Council, the local Victoria branch under the leadership of Chris Kilford, a good friend of the Centre. Together, we are hosting Roland Paris from the University of Ottawa, former advisor to our own Prime Minister, and he will be speaking on the subject, what does the Ukraine war mean for Canada? Whereas this will be all in person at the Student Union building. So please, first come, first serve. The space is limited. Added incentive, there might even be some refreshments available from 2 to 4:30. For the next little while, it's been a real pleasure for me, very enjoyable and quite successful. We've been gathering at 2 p.m. on Tuesday afternoons for discussions of current events. So if you are in the hallways, please bring your coffee or tea. We'll make a fresh pie. Some have even brought us some treats, some cakes and cookies. So please join us in the foyer for a discussion of current events and trying to keep track of, share ideas and sources of information and about current events. Okay, so thank you to our team for coordinating all of the business of these weeks. But also a special thanks to welcome Brent to the West Coast. We wish you the best day and thank you so much for this excellent talk.
I have to thank you for the opportunity.